Absolutely. Well, thank you. And thank you for being able to move your time a little bit earlier. I appreciate it because out here it's a little bit later. So thank you. I am Sabine. I am the DEI officer for Artemisia. I currently reside in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I'm really excited to be able to present this class to y'all today. It is something that is really near and dear to my heart. It's something I think most people have some sort of experience with in terms of either witnessing it or experiencing it personally. And so going over the most recent changes to and updates to the society corpora and policies. This is kind of what this class goes over, and different ways that we can handle situations that may come up. So this class is pretty packed, but feel free to put questions or comments in the chat, and we'll try and get to them. And there's going to be a few breaks throughout as well so that we can kind of talk about things. So this is the bullying, harassment, and discrimination class. We're going to talk about policies and reporting procedures within the Kingdom and SCA. And I did go through OnTier's document library. And so there's specific stuff for OnTier that also mirrors and maybe slightly different than the society or slightly more expounded. So we'll kind of go into that. This is me. I'm mundanely, I am a therapist, and this is why it's also super important for me to kind of talk about these things, because it affects not only my sort of SCA career, but also affects my mundane career as well. So our class outline is we're going to talk about the policy, the updated policy definitions and examples. We're going to talk about the legal reporting requirements when things get to a point of legality. And then we're going to talk about the SCA reporting procedures. The reason that this class, became so important to me was because, so I stepped into this officer role just about a year ago. And a couple months into it, I experienced some, sort of bullying behaviors as well in this office. And I was like, what do I do with this? I don't know where to go. I don't know who to contact, that kind of thing. And I'm the officer for this. And so I wanted to create this class to be able to share with people, like, this is how this should be handled and how we are looking to handle it in the future. So the previous definition was a little bit smaller. This was what it used to be. And it had, it was sort of this one page, this is what harassment and bullying includes, and it definitely needed a little bit of expansion. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. So the now definition is the SCA prohibits bullying and harassment of all individuals and groups. Bullying is systematic and unwelcome behavior which involves the use of influence, threat, intimidation, or coercion to cause hurt or harm to another person or group of people. When the bullying behavior is based on a protected class, that behavior is defined as harassment. And a protected class would be race, sex, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, age, or disability. So looking at what this can look like, there are overt bullying and harassment behaviors and covert. And this is not an inclusive list of examples, it's just some of them. So overt could look like verbal abuse, including using racial, homophobic, transphobic, ableist epithets, statements, basically. Non-consensual physical contact, violence, or threatening gestures. Displaying material that is offensive, degrading, or threatening to a protected class. Consistent demeaning remarks or malicious teasing, or stalking or predator behavior. Those are all the things that we really readily see, and it's like we can say, hey, you know what, that's what that is. And then there's more covert kinds of behaviors. I think these take a little bit more time to come out, and they are equally as important when they get addressed. So spreading rumors or innuendo with malicious intent, deliberate exclusion, isolation, or alienation of an individual without just cause. And I think that part's important because sometimes people may feel left out or excluded, and the group or the person that they felt excluded by had no idea that that was even what was going on. So I think when it's deliberate, that's a piece that's important to know. And then using rank, title, or office to intimidate others. And I don't know about you, but kind of looking at these lists, it kind of gives me a good idea of like, all right, this is what. So bullying and harassment, what it isn't. It's not singled episodes of social rejection, dislike, tactlessness, or forgetfulness. And it doesn't mean that we can't dislike people, right? Like, we have people we jive with, we have people we don't jive with. We just don't want to bully the people that we don't jive with. Mutual arguments, disagreements, or fights is not bullying or harassment. The termination, mutual or not, of a romantic relationship or friendship. This is, I think, super important because people could feel possibly bullied or harassed when a relationship ends and the other person didn't want that. So I think it's really important that this gets said. Reasonable constructive feedback or critique. And the test for bullying is the reasonableness of the behavior and the impact of that behavior on the recipient. Any questions here?
Oh, yes, I have a question if there's time.
Yeah.
So the whole tactlessness description that you use, I find that a very hard thing to apply to the SCA because of all the implied rank and hierarchy and that kind of stuff. And so I'm just like, could you expound a little bit of what tactlessness looks like in the SCA, especially kind of within this geek culture that we're encouraged to look the other way for a lot of behaviors, and that's something that I really struggle with.
That's fair. I think what it comes down to is that we're all going to be a little tactless sometimes, right? Like, we're humans, we're constantly learning tact, timing, and dosage, right? So I think, and to be honest, I think we have a lot of individuals in the SCA who may struggle with some of the sort of social etiquette kind of stuff, right? And so single episodes of tactlessness that aren't previous knowledge that they are aware of, that's what bullying and harassment is not. When it gets brought to their attention, like, hey, you know what? That wasn't the most tactful of things. Let's try saying it this way, or this landed on me in a not great way. Is that what you meant, right? And then helping them see a maybe more tactful way. If they choose to use the continual tactless way, that's when it can become, oh, right, these are repetitive. This is now a bigger impact than if it's a single episode of people who really didn't know how they were coming across. Does that help answer that?
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest piece here is if it gets addressed and it changes, awesome. That's not bullying and harassment. That's just human nature. If it gets addressed and it doesn't change, then that's when we start to look at these policies.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where it says the test is the reasonableness of the behavior and the impact of the behavior on the recipient. Does that mean that if somebody is repeatedly says horrible things, but the person they're targeting is confident enough to just shake it off, then it's no harm, no foul?
That's a great question. So I think it kind of depends on what the person is saying, because if they're saying it to a specific person and that person isn't bothered by it, then we can't necessarily feel what for that other person. That's for them to feel and for them to decide how to move forward. You could always bring up like, hey, you know what, that kind of stuff, like it kind of contradicts our bullying and harassment policies. And so you might want to think about like what message this conveys. It could convey that these kinds of behaviors are okay, whereas the SCA is saying it's not. And you can kind of put that in their court, but really that's up to them. Now, if the person is saying a more globalized statement that applies to multiple individuals, perhaps it's a racist statement or a bigoted statement, that kind of thing, then I think multiple people could address it. So again, it depends on if there's a single recipient, multiple recipients, and if there is that single recipient, it really depends on what that recipient wants to do with it. Does that help?
Yeah, it's mostly, this is complicated.
There's a lot of it depends, yeah, kinds of situations. And I think as much as we want to like go in and protect people from bullying and harassment, there's a line that we can only come to if it hasn't happened to us, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Is there anything else I can further help with that one?
I have a question regarding that. So granted that, you know, you can't be in someone else's shoes and experiencing what the individual who is, if it's something targeted at an individual, you aren't, you know, in the example that was just given, if it's somebody who can, you know, just shake it off and be like, yeah, okay, whatever. But there's also often observers who may be also feeling whatever the comments or actions are. And I think that's something else that needs to be taken into consideration, is the unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if those observers, sorry, go ahead.
No, just like the unintended targets, unintended victims of bullying and harassment, because not only might one person be an intended target, but also, I mean, particularly in the instance of, say, newcomers or people or would-be members, you're looking at, oh, well, no, you know, I thought I might join, but then I saw this behavior and nah, I'm out.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I think there's a piece to this that just because somebody doesn't want to, you know, proceed forward with a formal grievance kind of thing, the observers can still say, hey man, that's not cool. That's not cool to say. And that was a very sort of inappropriate comment or behavior, right? And it can still be called out. So that way it isn't unaddressed. So I definitely want to empower people to be able to speak up when possible. All right, thank you. Great questions so far, loving it. All right, moving forward. Participants engaging in bullying and harassment are subject to appropriate sanctions. If an individual believes they have been subjected to or have witnessed harassment, bullying, or retaliation, that person should contact a seneschal, the president of the SCA, or that kingdom's board ombudsman. So kind of going back to what we just discussed, if you are not the recipient of it, but you observe it, please say something about it. It's okay to say something about it. Now, when it is directed at a certain individual, they get the say on how far it goes, basically. So there is a non-discrimination policy as well. The SCA does not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, age, national origin, veteran status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, size, or any other basis of discrimination prohibited by law. Because we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We cannot discriminate. It could take away our nonprofit status if we were to engage in discrimination. And then this year, there was a sexual misconduct policy created as well. And we're going to spend a little bit of time discussing this. The SCA prohibits all forms of sexual misconduct, including but not limited to sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, and sexual violence. Such conduct violates the SCA core values and puts the SCA and participants at risk. So here's the SCA statement of core values. This is like the mission statement, right? Every company has a mission statement. This is what our underlying goal is, and these are what our core values are. So in pursuing its mission, the SCA is committed to excellence in its programs, communications, and activities, to act in accordance with the chivalric virtues of honor and service, value and respect the worth and dignity of all individuals, practice inclusiveness and respect pluralism and diversity, promote a safe and respectful environment for all SCA events, act with transparency, fairness, integrity, and honesty, be a responsible steward of SCA resources, and be committed to maintaining the trust of its members and participants. And it's the expectation of the SCA that its members and participants in all events and activities of the SCA will conduct themselves in accordance with these tenets. So when you sign up for your membership, or even when you sign up for an event, these are the things that you are stating that you will comply with. Pressing forward, let's talk about consent. We all have an idea of what consent is, and this is what is currently in the sexual misconduct policy. Consent, it's freely and affirmatively communicated willingness to participate in sexual activity, expressed by clear, unambiguous words. It's clear, the verbal voluntary agreement given by someone able to agree to an act. Someone may lack the ability to consent due to, for example, their age, their intellectual or other disability, or incapacitation from the use of drugs or alcohol. We will always view as unwelcome and non-consensual any sexual activity between an adult and any person below the legal age of consent. What I would say to this is that each state has its own definitions of ages for consent. And I encourage you to go on rain.org to look at what your state is and the different age discrepancies there. We can talk about this in a little bit in further detail when we come to the legal reporting requirements, but that can be kind of a sticky situation. Additionally, because consent is a voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity, someone who's incapacitated cannot consent. Incapacitated could be for any certain reason, right? Past consent does not imply future consent, and consent for one act does not imply consent for another. Silence or absence of resistance does not imply consent. Consent to engage in sexual activity with one person does not imply consent to engage in sexual activity with another. And consent can be withdrawn at any time, and coercion or force or threat of either invalidates consent. I'm seeing a few things in the chat, so let's take a stop here and see what's going on in the chat. Right. Yes, rain.org, thank you. And yes, without consent, the buffet would be criminal assault. Yes, it's more than just sexual, and we're talking about it just in the frame of the sexual misconduct policy. But yes, consent does go more than just sexual. I totally agreed there. Any questions so far with this? Okay, and just as a reminder, you know, an incapacitated person could be somebody who is, you know, a little bit buzzed to all the way totally drunk. Incapacitated person could be due to sort of an intellectual or physical disability. There's kind of a number of things that can mean incapacitated.
One of the things I do have a question with regarding this is the inclusion of verbal within the definition, because verbal isn't always an option. Verbal isn't always used, and there are clear there is clear giving of consent often between parties that does not include a "you up to this? Yes, no" kind of thing. And it's body language and such, that it doesn't necessarily involve a verbal communication. Yes, it's great to have verbal in there, but I've certainly been the one who hasn't consented. And even I look at that verbal and have some issues with it.
And I can see that point. And I think it's one of those things that covers multiple bases. first, I wasn't the one to create this, though I can see where the verbal would come from, in that societally we have kind of adopted a culture of sort of it's okay, you know, kind of shrugging consent, and that may not really fully represent somebody's consent. And so it allows that person empowerment to be able to speak to, I do give consent or I don't give consent, and kind of gives them that message of this is as much something you need to say as much as the other person needs to be asking. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it bugs me in the fact that I guess verbal does technically just mean in words, but for instance, for the deaf community, using ASL, does it then cover it or does it not?
That's a fair point.
Yes, it does. Sign language is a language. Those are words. Verbal means using words.
Yeah, and I mean, I even think if you write something down, like you're passing notes, right? And it's, do you want to have sex? And the other person, you know, says yes, that could count
Yes or no?
as a verbal kind of thing, right?
All right.
Yeah. So I think if that kind of helps, I think verbal is a bit more broad than maybe just sort of spoken language. It could be written language, it could be signed language, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I know. I'm yes, the actual definition is very broad. I think it tends to be tends to be viewed as, I suppose, layman's terms. What it means is generally tends to be thought of as audible communication.
Right, right. Well, thank you for that. No, I'm glad that you asked, because that was a great point. All right, well, moving forward. So the definitions of sexual assault, harassment, misconduct, and stalking. So sexual assault is an actual or attempted sexual contact with another person without that person's consent. It includes, but is not limited to, acts that constitute sexual assault under that state law, which is why it's important to look at your state laws. Harassment is any unwelcome verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature, and this is sexual harassment, that is sufficiently severe, persistent, or pervasive such that it unreasonably interferes with, limits, or deprives someone of the ability to participate in or benefit from the SCA events and activities. Sexual harassment includes, but is not limited to, acts that constitute sexual harassment under that state law. Sexual misconduct is any unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature that is committed without consent and or by force, intimidation, coercion, or manipulation. Sexual misconduct includes but is not limited to exposure of reproductive organs, sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, and sexual violence. So it's kind of a big umbrella term. Sexual misconduct also includes acts that constitute sexual misconduct under that state law. Stalking, the big one, means engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to A, fear for their safety or the safety of others, or B, suffer substantial emotional distress. Stalking behavior can include persistent unwanted communications to the victim by phone, email, or other social media, repeatedly sending the victim unwanted gifts, following or waiting for the victim at home, school, work, or elsewhere, direct or indirect threats by the stalker to harm themselves, the victim, or the victim's friends and family, or to damage the victim's property. It also includes, but is not limited to, acts that constitute stalking under state law. So this is, again, where I put out there, it's really important to look at your state laws and what may be included there. And the reason that they put these in there is that there are different things under each state law that kind of matches what each of these definitions are.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so with all this, there seems to be a very large conversation, or sorry, just a conversation going on about when it occurs at an SCA event versus when it's between SCA people outside an event. And I'm curious, just like how, could you help like put some scaffolding or framework around those ideas for me, please?
Absolutely. So if it occurs at an SCA event, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail. I have a reporting organizational chart that I have sent to your EDI council that they are working through to modify for your specific kingdom. But when it comes to your, like at an SCA event, then when possible, because the victim, you know, I get that they may not want to share this, and I'm really empowering, encouraging victims to come forward and share this so that it can be dealt with, is the event steward and the local seneschal needs to be informed immediately. Because at that point, if it infringes on any state law and we haven't done that, then we can also have some liability there. So if it is happening at an event, that needs to happen. And then it will go up through the chain through your kingdom seneschal, through possibly the society seneschal, depending on what has occurred. And potentially law enforcement gets involved as well, depending on what has occurred. If it is between two members of the SCA outside an event, then what I would encourage you or whoever is involved to do is to bring it to, now it would depend on if the two members are part of a local group together or if they're part of two separate groups. If they're part of two separate groups, you would go to the kingdom seneschal. If they are part of two local groups, then you would go to the local seneschal. If they want it to be dealt with in an SCA sort of form of the formal grievance procedure and sanctions and that kind of thing. And it's up to them whether or not law enforcement gets involved. If there is a minor, and we'll talk about this in a minute, if a minor is involved, law enforcement always needs to be involved. No matter what, that needs to be reported. If it's between two members and there's a victim and a perpetrator, then it is very much encouraged that the victim come forward and address it with their seneschals and then also get law enforcement involved if needed. Does that help answer that question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we'll go over that a little bit more in the reporting chart because I'm also a visual person and that's a visual thing.
Agree. Yeah, and your visuals are fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Okay, great. I'll move forward then with the legal reporting procedures. So to maintain the SCA's legal nonprofit status, we are required to comply with all state and federal regulations regarding reporting. So per corpora, sanctions and administrative actions should be proportionate and appropriate. Major sanctions, such as a ban on attendance or participation, should not substitute for appropriate administrative or legal action. Meaning that just because we may have banned them for this reign does not mean that we also do not get law enforcement involved if they need to get involved. Offenses against contemporary civil or criminal law should be dealt with through the appropriate legal system. And this does not preclude the SCA from taking other appropriate actions. So again, vice versa. Well, we call the cops on them, so we don't really have to do anything. You know, we don't have to go through the grievance procedure and send it on up for a sanction or whatever. That's also not true. They have to match. And so because I think we could get ourselves caught into a mess there if we kind of employed that. So just to clarify, if the state says to report it, we need to report it. And it doesn't mean that the SCA also shouldn't do anything about it. So let's talk about the items of bullying, harassment, and discrimination that also needs to be reported to the appropriate legal system, and then how this varies from state to state. So all of these things need to be reported. All of these top things have to do with minors, and the bottoms, not necessarily with minors. Minors could be involved, but then they would also go into that top thing. But all of these things need to be reported because there is a legal component to them. I would encourage y'all to look at what your state says in regards to sexual misconduct of a minor. because, and here's the thing that gets tricky. There are certain states, like for example, Artemisia, encompasses Montana, Idaho, Utah, and like a sliver of Wyoming, right? And each of these states actually has a different idea of what consent means. And so, for example, in the state of Utah, if you have a 14-year-old engaging in sexual activity with like a 17-year-old, that's not okay. And they're both minors. And I've had to, as a therapist, report a 17-year-old for engaging in sexual activities with a 14-year-old because of that. And it's important for us to be aware of our teenagers who are at events and things like that because of this issue. So I really encourage you to look at your state's policies around this so that you can keep everybody safe and up to date, and we can keep the SCA safe. These other items: aggravated assaults and or murder, hate crimes, stalking, domestic violence, dating violence, robbery and or burglary. All of these also need to be reported through the legal level. Any questions here? All right, awesome, moving forward. So your SCA status can be affected by mundane legal issues. Last year, the King of the East was expelled after a felony murder charge. And a question I get frequently is, what happens if you have a government record of being a convicted sex offender? That your SCA status could be affected by that if you are on that record. With serious offenses, what we discussed previously in the last slide, contact your Kingdom Seneschal, local authorities, and other reporting agencies, which could be Child Protective Services, Adult Protective Services, etc. And with less egregious, though still concerning issues regarding bullying, harassment, and discrimination, follow the reporting organization chart, which we will go into right now. I'm going to pull up a bigger image of this, but I want to touch on what's on the left first. So the DEI office, or the EDI office around here, is a support, advocacy, education, and empowerment office. It is not investigative. And so we will absolutely help with getting reports through the channels if need be, but we don't investigate. That's not our call or our place. However, if you make the DEI office aware of a potential report, it can ensure follow through. And we're working on sort of a victim resource packet as well, trying to get some victim advocacy going on because there has been a lot of that, unfortunately, and we want to make sure that we protect and support those who have been affected as much as we can. So let's talk about, let me get this chart up here. So this is for Artemisia. I did send it on to your council, so they, I think, are looking at ways that they can shift it for all of you out in Ontario. But this is the basic reporting chart. So where did the incident occur? If it occurred at a local level between members of the same local branch, or outside of the local level between two members of two separate branches. So this is what we can do. If it occurred at a local level, you ask the person, and this is really for anybody, would you like support in knowing if the incident is reportable or assistance in making a report? Then you contact your local DEI officer or EDI council member, right? If this occurred outside of the local level, then if I know that Ontario is different with the council, so I think all of this middle section would be contact a council representative. And I would say if it occurred more of an outside local level, then go more to, I believe it's Shea, who is kind of more of that representative for all of you. And I could be wrong, so please let me know if I am. However, if they don't want, if the person, and they don't have to involve us, that's totally fine. If they do want to make a report though, then if it happens in an event like we talked about, contact the local seneschal and the event steward, who then, and the dotted line means this is where this could go, right? It doesn't necessarily always go that way, but this is where this could go. It then goes to the Kingdom Seneschal, Crown and Heirs, or if it can be handled at a local level, great too. Might just go into a report for the Kingdom Seneschal, but then they don't have to deal with it. If it happened at an outside of the level, then it goes straight to the kingdom level. So then what happens if this has been done and there's been no response? Then feel free to get the DEI office involved so we can follow up with the Seneschal and be like, hey, any word on this? What's the follow-up? Because the Seneschal's office is the investigative office, right? And what can happen at that point is then the society Seneschal can get involved, the board of directors can get involved, as well as the corporate DEI officer for general equity and inclusion issues. So this is the board ombudsman for Artemisia. I'm not sure who your board ombudsman is for Ontier, but that is also something that can happen as well, as if you haven't received a response from the DEI officer, from the local Seneschal, from the Kingdom Seneschal, you've gone all those places, then feel free to contact your Kingdom Board's ombudsman as well. Does this help answer some of those questions from earlier?
Mm-hmm.
There are options for recompense as well if you have experienced bullying and harassment or discrimination. So you could receive a personal apology through email, maybe in person, sort of depending on how it's going. Usually it's through email. A personal apology that can be put in what we call the Sage is our Kingdom newsletter. I'm not sure what the name of your Kingdom newsletter is, but that would be advertised as well if that is something that you choose. And you can also get creative, right? You could get creative in terms of, I know this person is really good at pewter casting. Maybe they can make me some pewter coins for an event that I'm stewarding, and that could be the site token, right? We can get a little bit creative, I would say, but within reason. There are certain things, though, that also need the consideration of royalty and potential review of the bod. When you are asking for, and again, the victim can ask for these options of recompense. The Seneschal at that point says, all right, what would you like us to do? These are your options. If you are asking for these last three, that needs consideration of royalty and potential review of the bod. So you're asking for a partial banishment to the end of a reign, a banishment and continuation for their Highness's reign, or a sanction to society for expulsion. All of that goes up. I saw that there was something that came through on the chat. And Clovis, would you mind saying the crier? Is that what your newsletter is?
Yeah, that's the name of the newsletter, is the crier.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's something as well. I mean, I think there's a bunch of different options, and some people choose not to do anything, and that is totally your choice if this has been, if you've been affected in this way. So let's talk about some of the more serious ones, these last ones, in a little bit more detail. So the sanctions and the banishments. The board of directors of the SCA reserves the right to sanction any individual or group of individuals in the SCA regardless of membership status, title, or position. The board reserves the sole right to modify or waive these policies as it deems necessary and has the final authority on all sanctions. And this is what comes from Corpora. I'm just reading sort of what I found from Corpora. No person shall be subjected to a continuance of a sanction for more than 2 consecutive reigns under the circumstances that prompted the original Crowned Act. When there's a kingdom sanction, there's a couple different levels to it. You can have banishment from the royal presence, and you can have banishment of, like, they can still come to events, but they just can't be within like 50 feet of us. Or you can be exiled from the kingdom, which would require a review of the bod. Then there is a temporary removal from participation in society. The bod reviews that, and it lasts until the bod makes the final decision. Now, there's the serious transgressions of SCA rules, which include violation of the governing documents or other rules of the SCA, theft, misappropriation, or deliberate misuse of SCA funds or property, and situations in which an individual is under criminal investigation by modern law enforcement agency or is considered to be risk, and which could put the SCA or participants at risk, and behavior which could put the SCA or participants at risk or fear of imminent harm, and actions that endanger public health and safety. All of those things can lead to this temporary removal and then possibly go to a full-on society sanction. Because the society sanctions are emergency temporary removal from participation and can result in sanction being lifted or an R&D happening, which is a revocation of membership and denial of participation. An appeals process also exists in the sanctions manual for those who have had any of these sanctions or banishment. Are there any questions regarding the sanction process or the banishment process? Okay, and this, you can find this all online as well. And I'm also happy, if you want me to, I can send this PowerPoint to whoever needs it, because I have in the notes section of this PowerPoint referenced every single one of the corpora policies. So if you would like that, please let me know. All right, so helpful hints with the reporting this and these policies. Your voice is important. We don't know what we don't know, right? It's down there at the end. So making your voice heard helps everyone. And we live in a society where we are innocent until proven guilty, and that is why the investigation process, while it can seem lengthy and arduous at times, it's important. Because, and I think also at this point, a little bit more black and white, because we can screenshot things now, right? And so screenshotting things absolutely helps, which again, evidence is helpful. Making a report can open the door. So for example, say someone, Joe Schmo, has a history of sort of on the line bullying and harassment kinds of things. You're like, I'm not really sure. Even if you say, hey, I feel like this, you know, is bullying and harassment, it meets that definition based on what is provided in the policies and procedures. Even if they can't follow through with something right then and there, it allows for possible options to happen in the future, or it makes that person aware that they can't do that anymore. Either way, it opens the door for change. I would say apply wisdom regarding the recompense options. So if somebody, you know, says like F off to you, right? Yeah, that could be construed as verbal abuse and could absolutely be reported as bullying and harassment. And saying, I want a full-on total R&D for this person for saying F off, that it may not match, and you may not get as much as you hope for if things matched. So that's kind of what I would encourage there. And then I would say ask for help or resources, especially from your EDI council. That is what we are here for. So ONTIER has a specific bullying and harassment policy, which mirrors and matches a lot of what has been discussed. I actually think ONTIER was kind of like the go-getter here, because I think your documents were far more fleshed out than the societies were until recently. And so, like, good on you. So the Library of ONTIER has this SharePoint file for the specific ONTIER bullying and harassment policy. It includes inappropriate behaviors, illegal behaviors, what the allegation process is like, and it includes a formal complaint form at the bottom, which I thought was super awesome. So take a look at that. If you just go to your document library, it's right there in terms of the bullying and harassment policy. And then here's the contact info for the DEI EDI office. The corporate society DEI officer is Jessica, also known as Zara, and that is her email address. And then you've got ONTIER's EDI council, and this is kind of what I was able to pull up there. And so your EDI council consists of like 9 to 10 general members, chair, and then the Kingdom EDI officer, which would be Shea. That was kind of what I'm aware of. So I believe that is that for today. And I'm curious if there are any more questions or thoughts. I'm noticing some things that in the chat came up. Oh, okay, great question. Are local seneschals all trained in what to do when someone files a complaint? They should be. They should be. I don't know if it's happening, but they should be. So I think if this is an area where you are aware that there may be a discrepancy, I think bring that up to your Kingdom Seneschal. And I know that with the new society level Seneschal, I know that there's a lot of things coming down the pike of training and just making sure everybody's on the same page. And then, okay, yeah. So any other questions or thoughts?
I guess I have one more question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this group is for the sergeantry, which is this amazing leadership position within the Kingdom of Antir. And I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how, as the sergeantry, they can support this, this endeavor.
That's a great question. It's hard, so I think it's hard for me to say because I'm not exactly sure all of what the sergeantry encompasses. I'm curious to hear more from this amazing group of people we have to see what their thoughts are on that, since you have kind of more of an idea of what the sergeantry encompasses.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
As being a sergeant, one of the things that we actually swear on is that we are the go-to if there's something, whether best way to put this, I can't remember what it was for word verbatim. We are to, I guess assist would be about a good word. Any unaccompanied individuals that need help. So like, you know, for the simple system of we're standing in court and someone has called up, come to court, and they don't have another to walk them into court, or perhaps maybe due to health issues that have a hard time getting to court. We are expected to be done on the spot and ensure that that person gets up to court safely. And I believe there were other things that are kind of along those same lines, that we are go-to individuals to ensure that things get going in the right directions, because we're usually more senior and have experience more and know the right directions to head people so they can get their questions answered. Or if they need protection, they should be able to come to us and we should be able to help. I guess that's it in a nutshell.
I liked that. So to kind of summarize what I heard is that the sergeantry they're the people that to step up when needed, to protect when needed, and to provide that sort of assistance when needed.
Yep.
Did that help answer your question?
Yes. So for instance, something happened at a local baronial event, and sergeantry saw something, or in confidence somebody shared something with a sergeantry. Could you maybe hypothesize what the next steps of the sergeantry would be in that instance?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I would say in that regard, you have a couple different options. I would say doing nothing probably doesn't fit within the role of the sergeantry. So the couple options I see are that you can ask that person, all right, what would you like to do with this? We have a couple of options. as a member of the sergeantry, I would like to make the event steward and the local seneschal aware of this, because I don't think that what occurred was okay. Now,
Yes.
you can choose to make a formal report. You can choose to make a formal complaint if you would like. I do, you know, but then I think providing that sort of moral support for the person could be very beneficial. Be like, you know, I'm just here, I'm in your corner, and, you know, let's do this together kind of thing. Does that help?
Thank you. Yes, I think that helps me out a lot. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a request.
Mm-hmm.
When dealing with on-tier specific, but when you're dealing with the youth issues, whatever youth issues come up, whether it's an assault or whatever, I think that the Kingdom Yafa officer, the Kingdom Youth officer, needs to be notified, as well as the other Kingdom officers like the Seneschal, because that officer is is privy to some information that could eventually help out. But it definitely, if children are involved, especially like I said, in on-tier who runs the Yafa program, we do need to know that.
That's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I love that. That's a great point. Any other questions or thoughts?
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
I've had to deal with a lot of these situations, and it just like breaks my heart. And so thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this. Your breakout is fantastic. So there, what is the word when, I'm sorry, I'm losing my verbs right now, or my nouns right now, but when you say something and then somebody can say, oh, deformation of character kind of aspect. Could you speak a little bit about how to navigate those concepts within the SCA?
Absolutely. I love that you brought this up, because yesterday, in fact, I gave a training on intent versus impact, and this very much crosses that line. So what I would, number one, encourage you all to do is to stick to the observable behaviors. Say, this person engaged in this behavior, and this behavior, based on current policy and corpora, does not fit within our core values. It actually infringes upon the bullying and harassment policy. That does not show any sort of deformation of character when you stick straight to the observable behavioral facts. When we start to use judgment statements of, you know, like, they're just a bad guy, that kind of thing, that's where it can get a little, I think, defamation of character, and it deflects from the argument. And so if you stick with the observable, describable behaviors that you're seeing, that will be, that will show the impact of what's occurring. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. That one's, it's a sticky one. It is, it's kind of messy, and I think as long as we stick to there's a great video on YouTube of looking at what they did versus who they are, right? And it can get a little bit dicey at that point too, when somebody makes a racist comment, right? For example, you can say, hey, that was a racist comment. It does not mean you've called them a racist. Though I do think in our society, we have started to meld the two, and we need to start unmelding them, because there are plenty of people who just sort of make ignorant statements that don't realize that they can be perpetuating sort of a racist system unintentionally, right? And so I think we have to state with, you know, the specific, observable, measurable kind of stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Any others or any other thoughts I can help with? All right. Well, on-tier, y'all are in my heart right now with the fires. I am wishing you all a lot of rain and a lot of peace. Thank you for attending today, especially with everything that's going on for y'all.